So just for those that, suppose to refresh what it is that IFAC does, our mandate is set out within the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2012. So we have a pretty clear mandate that we generally look at 4 key areas feeding into our central role, which is independent economic analysis, but of course focused on the fiscal side of the economy. So assessment and endorsement of the macroeconomic forecast, which is something we've done in this round. We assess the government's fiscal stance, and of course then we have the technical compliance with both the domestic and European fiscal rules. So IFAC itself is made up of a 5-member council and a 6-member secretariat. And as we said, we look at the government's budgetary stance, the macro forecasts, and compliance with the fiscal rules. This is our 14th time publishing an assessment report. So what are we saying this time? What does the June 2018 Fiscal Assessment Report say? Well, I suppose the key message is that there's no case for additional fiscal stimulus in 2019. And what I mean by additional is beyond what the government have already set out. So the government should at least stick to its plans for 2019. So anything more expansionary than what it's set out in the recent Stability Programme update is not likely to be appropriate. So an appropriate policy, given the position of the economy, would be to increase spending in line with sustainable long-term growth. So to look and say, what is the sustainable growth rate of the economy? So given that the public finances, at least in the deficit side, are close to balance, we still have high levels of debt. The economy is probably running close to potential for 2018. So the appropriate policy in this instance would be to increase spending, the measure of spending that we look at, in line with sustainable long-term growth. On that then, that's the real growth. You'd add something for inflation. And doing all this implies a limit for spending increases or tax cuts of up to $3.5 billion. That's the starting point for Budget 2019. Previously announced measures, including sharp increases in public investment, which will increase by almost 25% this year with further increases planned for future years, mean that the government's scope for new initiatives in Budget 2019 will be limited. So while you have that up to $3.5 billion as your starting point, a lot of that has been consumed by previous announcements. So fiscal policy isn't just what happens on budget day. So whether that is the capital spending, public sector pay, etc., and demographic pressures. And unexpected increases in tax revenues or lower interest costs, both of which we've seen over the last number of years, should not be used to fund budgetary measures. So we should be looking at sustainably increasing spending. We say that this is the upper limit for Budget 2019, and in fact that improving the budget balance by more than planned would be desirable. Why is this? Well, this would recognise the potential risks of overheating and the opportunity provided by favourable times, the strong performance of the economy over recent years. And any revenues from a faster than expected recovery in housing construction should be used to build buffers, either through additional contributions to the rainy day fund or through faster debt reduction. So with the housing sector, there has been this expectation that housing output would begin to increase. We are seeing some increases, but of a very low base. But if it does reach maybe a trigger point where housing output increases quite rapidly, that could be tax rich, and that increase in output could be temporary to deal maybe with the supply backlog that's built up over the last number of years. We may see housing output increase temporarily, and the revenues linked to that shouldn't be considered to be permanent. And spending should not be allowed to continue to drift up as unexpected and likely cyclical or transitory revenues arise, such as those linked to construction. And over the medium term, the government needs a credible plan, focused on the right budgetary stance, as the Minister for Finance indicated he's going to do, and being prepared to be more cautious than the fiscal rules allow is the correct approach for the government to follow. Yet there's a danger that current policy framework is insufficiently equipped to prevent the return to pro-cyclical fiscal policy, something that we have had many years of experience of in Ireland. And finally, ending that cycle would be an appropriate step to take. So sensible tools such as the rainy day fund and medium-term debt target need more development if they are to be effective. So they could form part of this appropriate fiscal framework. And a working paper accompanying the report from IFAC today shows how a counter-cyclical rainy day fund could work with modest changes to the fiscal rules. Because one issue with a rainy day fund, of course, if you do set the money aside when times are good, you want to be able to spend it when it's required. So it may require a modest change or modest tweak to the fiscal rules in order to facilitate the effective operation of a truly counter-cyclical rainy day fund. So if you just look in more detail maybe at some of those points, first of all, the macroeconomic context. Well, there's been a rapid cyclical recovery in the economy since at least 2014, and this is continuing at strong pace. While there is uncertainty, most coherent estimates suggest that the domestic economy has been growing faster than its potential growth since around 2014, that we have had this catch-up following the crash, and growth has been higher than could be expected to be maintained over the long term. So estimates suggest that the economy is producing close to its medium-term potential in 2018, and will move perhaps beyond it next year and after. So looking at things like the unemployment rate and various measures of the economy, we're possibly close to potential at the moment, with a possibility of moving beyond that potential towards an overheating context after 2018. So the Council welcomes the Department's publication of alternative estimates of the economic cycle to help provide a sound basis for setting the economy and public finances on a sustainable path. Up to now, all the Department of Finance have published have been estimates of the economic cycle based on the European Commission's commonly agreed methodology. And since this has been introduced, the Department of Finance have themselves been saying that this approach is not appropriate for Ireland. So the Council welcomes the step taken by the Department of Finance in the most recent Stability Programme update to publish their own estimates of the economic cycle, where they see the Irish economy relative to its potential, and by and large the Department's views are similar to our own. They deviate from what the European Commission's approach says, but one of the reasons there is that the approach isn't appropriate for an economy such as Ireland. Taking an approach that might be more in line with what should be done, we see that the Department and IFAC have pretty similar views of the Irish economy that went through a deep contraction. 2010-2011 has been recovering since, and it's close to potential for 2018-2019. If we just look at the macroeconomic context, we see that employment has been growing strongly since 2013, 2011-2013, growing 3-4% per annum, perhaps even full-time employment growing at a faster rate as part-time employment has been falling. And while there is some moderation in the forecast period for employment, it still is a reasonably strong rate of growth. And I suppose this would support the idea that recent growth has been above what you'd expect over the medium to long term. So employment growth of between 2 and 2.5% for each year out to 2021, which in itself is reasonably strong. If you look at underlying domestic demand, a bit more volatile, given the measurement issues with the Irish economy, growing at somewhere maybe between 4-4.5% over the last couple of years. And again, forecast to moderate slightly, but grow at 3-3.5% out to 2021. Personal consumption expenditure has some measurement volatility in recent years, but again forecast to grow at just over 2% out to 2021. So a slight moderation of the growth we've seen in recent years. And in terms of a macroeconomic aggregate that we might use, GDP, of course, is highly distorted. We now have GNP suffering from its own distortion. So the CSO have given us an adjusted measure, gross national income, adjusted gross national income, which is termed GNI star. At present, we only have that nominal term, so it doesn't account for price changes. We don't have real growth. But you can see in recent years that nominal GNI star has been growing very rapidly, 8, 9, 10, even 11% in 2015. And that's expected to moderate slightly, but still growing at between 4 and 5% over the coming years, which maybe gives an indication of the level of expansion that's expected to continue over future years. Looking at the economic cycle, this gives us our picture going back to 2001. And I suppose you're just looking for how is the economy performing relative to its potential? What can sustainably be produced? And it's no surprise that for the periods 2009, 10, 11, the economy was below its potential. The unemployment rate approaching 15%. But over the last couple of years, of course, the unemployment rate has fallen and the economy is coming back towards its potential. And this idea of the Fiscal Council and the Department of Finance being reasonably similar is illustrated here with our views of the cyclical position of the economy. Anything above the line would suggest potential overheating pressures, that the economy is performing above its potential. But you can see the difference, what we now estimate to be happening in 2005, 6, 7. This is using the most recent data. This is not essentially what would have been said at the time, but using the techniques and the approaches and the measurements we have now, we can see significant overheating up to 2006, 2007, then the fall that came after that, and the recovery, and both are pretty much similar at the moment. So talk of overheating pressures isn't misplaced. There is potential for it to happen. It's not happening at the moment, but you can see that the general trend of both lines is upwards, and it is something that needs to be kept an eye on, and the government should be willing to introduce offsetting measures in future if overheating pressures emerge, particularly if this necessary and required increase in housing output happens. That given the current level of unemployment and the labour intensity of housing construction, if that does get ramped up, to make space for that to happen in the economy, it may be necessary to take counter-cyclical measures. But at present, overheating pressures seem muted, but things can change rapidly in the Irish economy. So we've seen that there's risks from the housing sector, where persistent undersupply has been evident for a number of years. So faster than assumed growth in housing output, which hopefully will happen, could prompt overheating pressures unless offsetting measures are taken elsewhere. So we are seeing some increases in construction activity related to residential housing. It is from a low base. The current macroeconomic forecasts build in fairly steady increases in housing output over the forecast period. Housing output increasing by about 4,000 units every year. Now, there are measurement issues about where we're starting from, but the forecasts themselves see output rising by about 4,000 a year. So if you take it that maybe we're at 16,000, 17,000 last year, again there is some dispute over that, you probably see it rising to 30,000, 35,000 by 2021, 2022, in those steady increases of 4,000 a year. So that's what's built into the forecasts. But of course, what could happen is that you could get a much faster increase in housing output, that there may be a trigger point with prices, maybe a trigger point with the ability of the housing sector, the construction sector, to deliver housing units. And if that is passed, of course, housing output could rise much quicker than 4,000 per annum. And that could see resources drawing to the construction sector. It could see an increase in inward migration for people to build houses, who of course need to be housed in the first instance. And it could lead to an increase, a temporary increase in government revenue, given the tax-rich nature of the construction sector. If we look at over the medium term and say, well, are there downside risks? So while the housing sector might provide upside risks to those growth forecasts, negative shocks will inevitably occur in future years. So we have been going through an expansion for quite a period of time. Expansions do have lifespans and do end. So there are clear downside risks over the medium term. And if we just look at what could cause problems for the Irish economy, we have the ongoing uncertainty around Brexit, changes to US trade policy, and of course the whole international tax environment, which could change either both the domestic sector, possibly primarily impacted by Brexit, and our foreign direct investment sector through US trade policy, and the fiscal side, and maybe corporation tax receipts through the international tax environment. And these are essentially just some of the risks that can be identified. And of course there's things that can happen that could go completely unpredicted. Maybe in recent weeks we've seen changes in relation to Italy, where certain problems can emerge quite rapidly and can be unseen. What we've done in the report is look at the impact of a large foreign-owned multinational firm exiting Ireland. So I'm trying to quantify the risk of a large sort of FDI operation leaving Ireland, and look at it from the corporation tax, the employment, the pay, and the impact on various measures of the economy. And the IFAC report highlights how corporation tax receipts would be particularly vulnerable to the exit of a large foreign-owned multinational firm, that in relative terms the biggest impact would be on corporation tax receipts if this was to be one of the, say, the top 10 corporation taxpayers, with the top 10 payers contributing close on 40% of corporation tax receipts. So if you're looking at the concentration risk, you can see it being quite rapid. So corporation tax receipts themselves are forecast to remain at record high levels and near their peak as a share of exchequer taxes. So if you look at the impact of a large firm and say, well, if we were to lose such a company across a range of measures, what would be the loss to the economy? So for corporation tax, a typical large firm, you may lose maybe on an annual basis 276 million of corporation tax receipts. That's sort of a stylised example across one of the large companies that might be paying corporation tax in Ireland. Of the total corporation tax receipts last year of 7.4 billion, the loss of one of those would represent close to 4% of corporation tax receipts. So just one company would be almost 4% of corporation tax receipts. If you look at other fiscal measures, you look at employee taxes, income tax, USC, PRSI, the loss would be about 62 million, and that would represent just 0.4% of the total. So while the employment is important, the impact on the fiscal side will be seen far greater through the corporation tax, an impact of around 4% of receipts compared to an impact of just approaching 0.5% for employee taxes and PRSI. And if you look at the impact on earnings on the economy, employee net earnings, if the employment was lost, it'll be 0.3% of employee net earnings. So again, in overall terms, it's possibly something that the economy could absorb a relatively small amount if one of these, while large companies, was to leave. But the biggest impact would, of course, be on, relative impact would be on corporation tax. If you look at economic activity and some of the broader measures for the economy as a whole, gross value added, again, kind of just a stylised example of what one of these large companies might be contributing to the overall levels of economic activity. For GVA, you're looking at around 2%. Again, maybe highlights the distortions in our national accounts, feeding through into gross domestic product, etc. And if one company could potentially be responsible for 2% of that. And if you see with employment, it's just 0.1%. Even if we take it to have 2,000 employees with over 2 million at work, the loss of one of these large companies, if it had 2,000 employees, would be about 0.1% of employment. So again, something that the economy could absorb if it was just to be one, if it was to be a number of those companies, you'd see those impacts increase. And just to highlight the increased reliance in corporation tax receipts, the chart shows the share of tax receipts coming from corporation tax, exchequer tax receipts, and you can see that it's close to record highs. 2001, 2002 was the last time it was at these peaks, although it didn't remain there. And you can see the level shift that occurred in 2015, and it's forecast to stay there. So in nominal terms, corporation tax is expected to get close to 10 billion by the end of the forecast period, whereas 2013, 2014 it was 4 billion. So quite a large jump, and one jump that in the forecast at least is expected to remain there. If we look at the overall fiscal context, so while the economy itself has been performing strongly, to a certain extent we may not be seeing that work through to improvements in the fiscal side. So debt obviously remains high, and improvements in the budgetary front have somewhat stalled since 2015. So Ireland's debt burden is still amongst the highest in the OECD, and is understated by standard GDP comparisons because of the distortions that affect our GDP. That may not be and is not the appropriate benchmark by which to set our public debt against. And set against a comparable measure of national income, like the CSO's GNI star, the net debt burden at the end of last year is equivalent to 87% of GNI star, the sixth highest in the OECD, behind only Italy, Portugal, Belgium, France and Japan. So the GDP metric might give us a misleading view of where we stand relative to our public debt. It is still, in gross terms, 200 billion. Yes, there are some assets that can be offset against that. And if you look at net debt, our net debt is 87% of GNI star. So if you take the upper threshold, the reference value from the EU fiscal rules, you're looking at a 60% level. Of course, that being the upper threshold. And the government itself have decided to set targets in terms of GDP at 45%, but it's not clear when it intends to achieve that. And it likely would be better if such a target was set rather than the GNI star and actually became a target with a defined path towards. So a strong cyclical recovery has occurred in the economy, unemployment falling, and this has been reinforced by a number of favourable tailwinds. On the fiscal side, of course, you have the corporation tax we've gone through, and equally we have reductions in interest expense. However, despite this, the government's primary balance has barely improved. So by primary balance, we mean the balance excluding interest costs. If you look at what the government is spending, excluding interest, relative to what it's taking in, what is the situation? So debt remains high, though falling. But if you look at the primary balance, so the dashed line is the nominal balance, the number, excluding one-offs. And you can see the public finances went into free fall 2008, 2009. A lot of hard work to bring it back towards a reasonable position. But since 2015, if you look at the primary balance, you can see it reached a surplus of around 1.6, 1.7% of GDP in 2015, and then has been relatively stable since then. And of course, because we're saying the economy is going through a cyclical recovery, if you were to take account of the economic cycle, and if the economy, as we believe, is possibly growing ahead of its potential, you should actually be improving your primary balance. So in structural terms, taking account the position in the economic cycle, the primary balance is slightly deteriorated. So whatever benefits the economy has been generating over the last number of years have by and large been used, and you see a slight deterioration in the structural primary balance. And this is using sort of our estimates of the economic cycle. But of course, as we showed earlier, these are quite similar to the Department of Finance's current estimates, and these were only published in the most recent Stability Programme update. So the report highlights how spending drift has been a key contributor to the stalling and improvement for the government's primary balance. So why haven't things improved over the last number of years if the economic performance has been so strong and if tax receipts have been bolstered by various measures, or various sources of income? So if you look at successive forecasts of expenditure and look at them from a range of government publications, going back to Budget 2015 and then going forward to the most recent Stability Programme update, and say, well, what was the expected level of spending for each of those years? So you can see in recent years, particularly once we get to 2015, 2016, 2017, that as you go through each iteration, each subsequent budget or SPU publication, the level of spending is being revised up. So as the additional receipts that the economy is generating are coming in, the planned level of expenditure are increasing. And hence we're not seeing the improvements in the primary balance that might otherwise be seen if you didn't have this spending drift, if you didn't have increases in planned levels of spending, by and large based on the increases in receipts. So the planned primary balance has shown very little change, even as revenues rise. So this is the primary balance, the numbers we'd have shown in the previous chart, from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 last publications. And again, you can see that even though things have improved in recent years, in the most recent publication, you can see that back in 2015, the budget that was expected at the primary balance for 2018 would be over 8 billion, but over subsequent periods that has been revised down. as the level of spending has been revised up, and rather than having a primary balance of over 8 billion for 2018, it's likely we'll have one of around 4 billion. And then if you subtract the interest expense of around 5 billion, you get the overall deficit, something just under a deficit of around 1 billion. So the primary balance just excludes the interest expense. As we said, there are sensible tools needed to develop to prevent a return to pro-cyclical fiscal policy. So we have proposals that are in the ether, such as the rainy day fund and a medium-term debt target, but these do need more development. How will the rainy day fund operate? We'll hopefully get more detail over the coming months, but it is something we've been looking at for a while. And the government's own medium-term debt target. Within the publication itself, the shortening of the horizon in the government's forecasts from 5 years to 3 is not compatible with the aim of achieving medium-term fiscal stability. So if it was in line with what was happening in their forecast 12 or 18 months ago, we'd have got forecasts out to 2023. As it is, that forecast horizon has been shortened, and we're now down to a 3-year forecast horizon. So it would be nice to see it extended back out to 5 years again, because 3 years is a relatively short forecast horizon, and one where more information is provided will always be better. So as stated, there's a working paper also published by IFAC this morning that shows how a counter-cyclical rainy day fund could work with modest changes to the fiscal rules. This is something that will have to be agreed at EU level, and there are suggestions that concepts such as this are feeding into discussions around changes to the EU's fiscal rules. So it explores how such funds can be used to address pro-cyclical bias in measurements of the cycle, which underpin the EU fiscal rules. This is back to the EU's own commonly agreed methodology, or perhaps even all measures of the economic cycle which suffer from this pro-cyclical bias of saying potential is higher when the economy is performing better, and also to enhance the scope for fiscal stimulus in future downturns, while making it more desirable to set aside savings at good times. But if you are going to set the money aside, you do want to be able to use it when you need it. There has to be the benefit of actually contributing to something like a rainy day fund, that the fiscal rules don't tie your hands when the economy does need the stimulus. That it can't just all be in one direction. It can't just be about dragging spending down. So the speed limits for government spending are rising as the economy grows fast. So this is the pro-cyclical bias that could be built into the fiscal rules. So if you look at the reference rate, which feeds into one of the fiscal rules, the expenditure benchmark, what is the reference rate for which the adjusted measure of spending can grow? And you can see in Ireland that during the 90s it rose quite rapidly, has fallen as some of the years of the crisis feed into the calculation, and it's a 10-year average, and then in recent years has been rising again. So there is this tendency for the rules themselves to have a sort of a pro-cyclical bias built into them, and that you can see it's increasing over the coming years, and maybe trying to smooth this out a small bit would be an appropriate sort of objective for a rainy day fund to try and achieve. Maybe to take money out when the economy is performing strongly, but equally to be able to get it back in when you need it. So the Council assesses there's no case for additional fiscal stimulus in 2019 beyond existing plans. So the plans as set out are in line with prudent economic and budgetary management. Improving the budget balance by even more than planned, though, would be desirable, especially given the risk of overheating, the potential for some revenues to be temporary, and the fact that we're currently going through favourable times with issues on the horizon that can present downside risks: Brexit, US trade policy, international tax environment, and just things that we simply can't see. And the government needs a credible plan for the medium term. Focus on the right budgetary stance is the correct approach. What should fiscal policy be doing in overall terms for the economy? And then within that, individual measures can be chosen. But if you look at the totality of what we're doing, is the correct approach. But the current policy framework is insufficiently equipped to prevent a return to pro-cyclical fiscal policy, particularly if it's just done on a year-to-year basis. A more medium-term approach would be appropriate. So that's essentially what we say in our June 20 2018 report.